Hello, and welcome to this week's study going through the book of Luke. Today we are going over Luke chapter 21, and the first part of this kind of runs off of what Tommy was talking about last week. So I'm going to read a story that he talked about before we go in. So Luke 20, starting at verse 45, and in the hearing of all the people, he said to his disciples, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love greetings in the marketplaces and the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts, who devour widows' houses for a pretense and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." So it starts off with this, or ends that chapter, I guess you could say, with, sorry, with the table I'm on is uneven, and I just put my feet on it and it just went crazy. So I apologize. But uh, he points to the scribes and he says, "Look at them, how they use their power and use their position to abuse those in a lower position." And the reason I mention this story is because it ties into the first story in Luke 21. I actually think the two stories go together because he points out these people who are supposed to be leaders and examples inside the temple. But really, the most powerful leader and the best example that Jesus sees out of all these righteous people is this widow who comes into the temple. Jesus looks up and he saw the rich putting their gifts into the offering box, and he saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. And he said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them, for they all contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on." And you see a very stark contrast between this woman's heart and her giving compared to those who were supposed to be the example and their giving and their attitude. It says, if you're going to model anybody in this temple, don't look to the leaders, look to this woman. She's the one who's doing it right. And then, as he was speaking, these people look around and they marvel at the temple and all its beauty and all its power. They had this idea that the temple was going to last forever, that nothing was going to take it away. It was where God resides, and this is the place to be. But Jesus is going to go in and warn them about that kind of thinking and foreshadow the destruction of the temple. And verses 5 through 33, I think, kind of work together. Jesus points out, of course, the destruction of the temple that comes later. And then he also kind of ties in end times thinking too about his second coming and the destruction that's seen there as well. A lot of what we will pick up later in Revelation if you read that book. And so these are kind of tied in together as a way to show the temporary aspect of what's seen around us, right? And I think that verse 5 and verse 33 kind of cap in this section. You have verse 5 that starts off this long section about this type of thinking and the destruction and judgment that it contains, and then it's wrapped up in verse 33. So that they're looking at the temple and saying, "Wow, look how beautiful this place is." And Jesus is going to go on and talk about not only the destruction of the temple, but the destruction that's going to be seen through the rest of history, about wars and famines and all these different things that are going to take away and kill in some instances. And they're probably going to be left asking, well, what's going to stand? Like, what is there going to be if all this is going? Then what's going to be left? And I think verse 33 cap ends this section really well. "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." And that's a verse that's echoed in other parts of Scripture about how the world around us will fade away, will pass away, but the words of God, the words of Jesus will stand forever. And you can trust in what he says and where he leads you. And so I think that's a big part of this section. But also in this section, he hits on how they're supposed to live in the midst of all that. How they're supposed to live in the midst of not only famine and war, but even persecution against them. Because, of course, the Christians in this time and later as we go through the book of Acts are going to face persecution and they're going to face all types of different stuff. How are they supposed to live in the midst of all that? And so Jesus says in verse 11, there will be great earthquakes in various places, famines and pestilence, and there will be terrors and great signs from heaven. But before all this, they will lay down their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors for my name's sake. What are we supposed to do? This will be your opportunity to bear witness. It says, man, all this different stuff is going to happen. And it's not going to be great stuff. But this is your opportunity to stand in the midst of all that and point to the one who you serve. And as I was reading these sections, I couldn't help but think of our brothers and sisters in Ukraine who are facing all kinds of different stuff. But we've been able to see all these encouraging and brave and awesome stories about Christians in the Ukraine who stand firm in their faith and who, in the midst of all that's happening to them, point to God and trust and lean on Him through the midst of all that. I think they've been great examples to us, and we continue to pray and do all we can for them. But we also need to look at them as an example of, man, they're doing it right, of being in the midst of all that. How can I still use this as an opportunity to bear witness to the one who I serve? And we've actually been kind of talking about some of this stuff in the youth group because there's all kinds of people on social media recently with all this stuff, especially in Ukraine, but with all this stuff going on and all the news that we have, they're taking all these different things that are happening in our world and saying, look, these are the signs that the end has come. It's coming. This is what the Bible is talking about. And who knows? I think Jesus is very clear when he says it will come like a thief in the night, right? You're not going to know. But Jesus is going through. He's like, that's not what this is for, right? It's not to give you a prescription of when I'm coming, but to say that in the midst of all this, this is how you're supposed to react. This is how you're supposed to live. This is where your focus is supposed to be, on using every opportunity I'm given, no matter good or bad, to bear witness to God and to what Christ has done for us. And so there's a lot of stuff that I'm kind of blown over in this chapter, and especially in that section. But I think that gives you a highlight of what's happening and where the focus is at, on the firmness and the truthfulness of Christ and what he says, and then on the charge of what we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to live in the midst of that. I think those are the two focuses in this chapter. And he goes on to close it out, kind of saying the same thing. It says in verse 34, but watch yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and cares of this life. And that day will come upon you suddenly like a trap, for it will come upon all who dwell on the face of the whole earth. But stay awake at all times, praying that you may have strength to escape all these things that are going to take place and to stand before the Son of Man. Saying, like, man, a lot of stuff is going to happen. A lot of stuff is going to happen. But you need to be ready at every second to say, to live in a way that reflects and honors Christ. To live in a way that says, I'm ready to be with God, whatever that looks like. I trust and I lean on him. And I want to show that in the way I live, the way I talk, the way I act, bearing a witness even in the midst of persecution and craziness. So I think that's a good overview, or maybe not to brag or anything. No, I think that's a an overview, at the very least, of chapter 21. I encourage you to read it for yourself and see what else you see in this chapter. Next week, we'll be going over chapter 22. But as we wait for that time, how can we live in a way that seeks every opportunity to bear witness to God and what He has done for us through Christ? Hope you have a fantastic week, and we will see you soon.